It's kind of the way the whole movie was. We never just walked away from something because it was a little more difficult or...
Woo! The Lord of the Rings movies are better than the books. Hey. First of all, what's shaking? My name's Cam. Welcome back to another video. I genuinely have a lot more love for the Lord of the Rings films than I do for the books. And I know in the world of being a book enthusiast, saying that any movie adaptation is better than the book is like, well, it's basically as disrespectful as whacking off in a cemetery. But it happens. It just does. Inkheart, 1408, Matilda are just a few examples of some movies that I think were better than the books. And while I may not be able to say the same for The Hobbit, I really do think that the Lord of the Rings should be added to that list. I am going to explain myself, and in grueling detail, don't worry. I don't think that the book or books are bad, obviously, and in a lot of ways they're obviously superior to the movies. But I believe that a lot of the creative decisions made by the cast and the crew behind the trilogy resulted in a lot of ways, a better story. In particular, the combined effort of Peter Jackson's directing and Fran Walsh's screenwriting, along with the absolutely mind-boggling dedication and creativity of the practical and visual and special effects teams, all of those things put together created what I think could have only been created with those people involved. Alright, look, I'm going to be real with you. This video is going to be pretty long, and it's pretty much going to be an unbridled praise of the Lord of the Rings movies. But obviously I am also going to be going through a lot of the creative choices that were made that make the movies different from the books, and I'll be talking about why I think those were good decisions. This video in itself is going to be a bit of a journey, but if you love Lord of the Rings, I think you're going to have a whole lot of fun watching it. And it would also mean a lot to me if you let me know what you think in the comments below. Now, before I start talking about the differences between the movies and the source material, and why I think one is better than the other, I do want to talk for a bit in particular about why I think, or how I think, the movies really changed the game, or changed the film industry at large. Maybe even changed the way storytelling is done. Or maybe I'm just being hyperbolic. Who knows? Let's figure it out. I just think there are a ton of people who don't understand just how insane this trilogy was when it came out like 20 years ago. The time we're in now, we have movies like, Avengers Endgame, etc., where special effects like this are just commonplace, they're even expected, so the bar is inherently high. But in 2001, Lord of the Rings did things that, in retrospect, seems impossible with what they had. I don't think that you could say the trilogy had a small budget when compared to other Hollywood movies of the era. They did have quite a lot of money behind it, but I also think that when you compare that to the end result, you realize that they were spinning gold out of straw. There's more than 10 hours of behind the scenes footage for all of the movies in the trilogy, pretty much for free on YouTube. You can find it very easily just by looking up, Lord of the Rings behind the scenes. There's about 10 or more hours worth of behind the scenes footage, and yes, I've seen it all. I just want to say this, if you are a Middle-earth fan, watch it. Trust me, you have to trust me on this. It will completely change the way that you experience the movies. I could spend hours listing all of the very particular and specific things they did behind the scenes that were either genius, brilliant, or inhumanly dedicated, but I won't yet. For now, I think I'll just give you a couple of examples that I think are good ways of showing just what they were willing to do. One fact that still kind of blows my mind is that a large portion of the Rohirrim army, the cavalry, the large tsunami of horses, a large section of that was not CGI. I think it was about 300 horses worth, if I remember right, from the footage I was just talking about before, which still to this day is an insane amount of live animals to have in one place. That is a crazy amount of horses to be trying to effectively act in a movie. And the movie crew for Lord of the Rings didn't have all of those horses themselves, but they wanted more of the army to be real rather than CGI, so that it could really pull you into the climactic moment that it was when the riders of Rohan come over the peak. They didn't have a lot of the horses themselves, so they actually had a lot of horse enthusiasts and farmers and riders and horse racers in New Zealand where they were filming the movies. They had those people come there to be extras with their own horses. The logistics of having that many extras with that many animals on set alone is not many other people would do it. Peter Jackson has to be one of the very few directors who would hear that idea be pitched and not turn around and say, get fucked. So a lot of the writers weren't actors, and funnily enough, a lot of them were women. The reason I say that's funny is because of the context of that part of the movie, specifically the context of Eowyn's character arc. She is a woman hiding within an army of men. But that isn't even the point I'm getting to. That alone is crazy enough, but that's not the point I'm getting to here. A lot of people actually already know that trivia fact. I've seen it shared around on Facebook quite a lot. But I haven't seen many people talk about this. Think about the amount of costumes needed for that many riders or that many extras. Peter ran into a bit of a problem with his budget. They could use real chainmail for those riders, but the problem is it was too heavy, and for the amount of hours they would be filming and having these riders on the horses, it just wouldn't have worked. Or they could use prop chainmail, but the problem with that is that it didn't look real. It didn't look good. It almost negated the effectiveness of having all these real horses come in if the people on them looked like they were wearing costumes. So what they decided to do, and this is kind of this is just insane to me. I wouldn't want to be the person who gets picked out for this job. They had a very small team of people make the armor for those riders from scratch. They made it out of a more realistic and lightweight material, basically just doing it themselves. And I'm talking about chainmail. I'm talking about little links, little circles of chain, putting them together one by one until you have a full piece of armor for 300 plus extras. That's just, oh man, it even hurts to visualize doing that myself. There's just, you couldn't pay me enough. So that's just one example of the crew taking enormous pride in the practical effects for the movies. I just think it's so impressive that they said, no, we're going to do this right, and they put in the time and the effort into something that not many people would, because they truly believed it would have a better end result. I mean, they could have done it all with CGI, but it just wouldn't have looked as good. And I think that's why the Hobbit trilogy didn't feel the same. It didn't feel like it had that passion and that love behind it. I don't hate those movies, actually. In fact, I think I like them a lot more than most other people, and I am positive that Peter Jackson and all the returning cast and all the new cast and crew, I'm sure they still put in as much passion and effort as they could into making those movies. But I think this is one of the rare instances where advanced technology was a setback. The Hobbit trilogy has nowhere near as much practical effects as the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and you can tell. Compare the orcs or the creatures in The Hobbit to the movies made 10 years earlier. I really do think the earlier ones looked better. The technology was better, but it just didn't feel real. And all of this that I'm talking about right now is super ironic because the original Lord of the Rings trilogy changed the game with their CGI. In particular, fantasy's sexiest bachelor, Gollum. Thanks to the special effects team and in particular Andy Serkis, Gollum was an absolute game changer. Gollum wasn't just amazing because of the special effects that to this day still look just as good, but also, and it's kind of a bummer that not many people acknowledge this, but Andy Serkis's acting as Gollum was incredible. The Lord of the Rings movies is a trilogy of films that can be appreciated not only as incredible movies, but also for all of the work that went on behind the scenes. Every single actor was brilliant. Almost every single creative decision made was brave and clever. 20 years later, I can say without a single drop of irony, which is hard for me, trust me, that these movies have aged perfectly. Every time I rewatch them, nothing looks dated, nothing looks dodgy. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for another favorite movie of mine from, I don't know, the early 2000s, Spy Kids 3. I'm going to talk about a few of the major changes made between the books and the movies that I think resulted in a better story. And the best place to start is with the man that impregnated every early 2000s woman with just a look. Strider, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, last of the Dunedain. There are quite a few glaring differences between the character in the films and the source material, but the most important one in my opinion is his character arc, and I would say fundamentally his character at large. In the books, Aragorn had not only accepted his destiny as the rightful king of Gondor, but he actively defended his claim to it. I don't hate Book Aragorn by any stretch, in fact I really like him, but like a lot of the other characters, he seems a lot more linear and two-dimensional in Tolkien's work. He doesn't have to earn his place as a king because that's something he already believes belongs to him. He's still noble, brave, and compassionate, but it could be argued that that's just an inherent trait of someone who thinks they are a king, an inherent trait of his title or the title that he thinks he should have. Also, I don't mean to be dramatic, but Book Aragorn kind of borders on being a superhero, or at least when it comes to fighting and his abilities and his senses, he is on par with the Legolas. In the movies, that's obviously not the case, and I'm glad they pulled back on that because it really helps to make Aragorn feel like more of a grounded character. And with him being much more human, it really highlights his bravery and his skills as a tracker and a swordsman. In the trilogy, we have the incredible Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn that seemingly has no interest in being the king of Gondor. What I love about this is that Aragorn is almost like a chosen one character, like the chosen one trope, but unlike a lot of other chosen ones, he doesn't mope about it or complain to his crew about the responsibility. He doesn't do all of that irritating stuff like a lot of other chosen ones. And he isn't even necessarily opposed to being king. He just doesn't believe that that claim or that title is owed to him. What this change does, what this creates, is a character arc where we have to watch Aragorn earn the respect of not only the other kingdoms within Middle-earth, but also, the respect of himself.
Scatter in the power of self-respect.
In the book, Aragorn always has Anduril, the King's Sword with him. He always has that, or at the very least, he always has the pieces of it with him. But in the movie, he only gets that sword when he has finally accepted his role and the responsibility that comes with it. The sword being reforged and it being given to Aragorn by Elrond of all people had such an enormous impact because it symbolized the moment that he would no longer be Strider the Ranger, but rather Aragorn the King. And the beauty of it is that we get to see Aragorn earn that claim. We see that in moments like him being the first, aside from Gandalf, to pledge his life to Frodo and the mission to destroy the ring, or when he resisted the temptation of the ring and let Frodo go out on the rest of the journey alone, or when he became best bros with a dwarf and an elf and led a little side quest to go save a pair of simple little hobbits from a pack of orcs and Orcai, when he helped to advise the King of Rohan to have Gondor's back. That's just a very short list of things, and not even all of the things that he did before even getting the Sword of the King. And all of the stuff that comes after that. I think, put simply, one Aragorn was a king working towards reclaiming his throne, and the other was a ranger earning his place as a king. And I think one of those things is a much more fascinating and emotional story than the other. This is a really quick point, but I would hate myself if I didn't say it. Hey, wait a minute. I already hate myself. I want to talk about Arwen, the love interest of the previously mentioned ranger. She has a much more active, doesn't feel like the right word here, but let's say a much more visual role in the movies. The love that Aragorn has for Arwen is a huge point in both the book and the trilogy. However, you only really see much of her in the films. Obviously, it doesn't hurt that she was played by Liv Tyler. So getting these moments of physical connection between those two characters, I think, really helped to show just what the stakes were here for one of the most important characters, for Aragorn. And plus, while it does have the trade-off of removing a pretty damn cool scene for Frodo as a character, the scene with Arwen and the Ringwraiths was bad ass. I think the whole sequence with Arwen at the Fort of Bruinen really shows you that the elves are a lot more than just good eyesight and backflips. That's pretty much all I have to say about Arwen. I just think it was a really good creative decision to have her pop up a lot more in the story. So in the book, or books, almost like an epilogue to this epic journey, to this epic quest, Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin return home to the Shire to find that it has been, for lack of a better word, enslaved. The Shire is now under the control of Saruman and Grima Wormtongue. They pretty much fled there after the fall of Isengard, and this leads into a bit of a separate, self-contained story where the now well-seasoned hobbits have to organize a revolt. It is really, really cool, and I highly recommend reading it if you haven't already, or at the very least watching a video explaining it. You can just look up the Scouring of the Shire. But I have to say, I am really glad that they didn't put it in the movies. The conclusion that we get after the, huge battle in Return of the King and the destruction of the ring in particular is exactly the payoff that this long adventure has been building up to. I think it would have been a huge disservice to the story at large to cut into a happy ending by trying to build up again towards another climactic conflict, after everything that had just happened. As cool as it would have been to see the Scouring of the Shire on the screen, it just would have been too tiring. Also, and perhaps more importantly, I think that keeping the Shire untouched made this scene possible. And that scene, I think, is one of the most powerful in the entire trilogy. Although I used the words happy ending, the end of The Lord of the Rings isn't really a happy ending for a lot of the characters. Sure, at this point everything worked out for the hobbits. However, that scene perfectly captures the mood that you need to feel as the viewer before Frodo leaves Middle-earth. These hobbits just saved the world, but no one in the Shire knows or cares. Life has gone back to normal for the hobbits, and they should be happy about that. But are they? How can you go back to a life as a simple hobbit after everything they had just been through? How can you go back to that after being an active and huge part of the war to end all wars? And not just that, but despite the fact that they have effectively saved the world, they still went through a lot of horrible, horrible stuff. They're traumatized. I think it was truly necessary for our four hobbits to be the only hobbits to see the darkness and the corruption and the evil, and maybe even the pure excitement that lies outside of the Shire. Because that way, we can truly empathize with the fact that sometimes things going back to normal isn't always a happy thing. So on the topic of cutting things out for the movies, I have to mention Tom Bombadil. Tom is a character that the gang runs into quite early in their journey, and there is a lot of speculation around who or what Tom is, or what Tom represents to Lord of the Rings, or at the very least what Tom represents from Tolkien's perspective. Tom Bombadil is a somewhat enigmatic dude who lives in the forest and claims to have been around since people first started coming to Middle-earth. It's suggested that he is extremely powerful and perhaps even omnipotent. Some people think he represents God or a god in the story, which in a lot of ways would make sense. Tolkien was quite a religious dude, and it's pretty much 100% confirmed that a lot of things in The Lord of the Rings are an allegory for religious symbolism. Other people think that Tom Bombadil is a self-insert of Tolkien, like Tolkien put himself into the story as the creator of the world. I honestly have no idea. I don't know. There are a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to Tom Bombadil, and I think that is exactly why I'm glad he wasn't in the movies. I think arguably he's not important to the major plot, and the confusion that his presence would bring with it, I just don't think would be worth the 10 minutes that he would be on screen. I will empathize with people that would have preferred Tom be in the movie though, and I will say that I agree. Taking Tom out did also result in removing the Barrow Wights, which is kind of a bummer. I think a lot of people don't realize just how many horror elements there are in The Lord of the Rings. A lot of sequences that I think are just straight up horror. And the Barrow Wights I think definitely would have been the scariest of the entire trilogy. I think that would have been brilliant to see on screen. Peter Jackson has directed horror before. I think the Barrow Wights would have been terrifying, so it's a little bit of a bummer that they were cut out. I will say that. So Samwise Gamgee is one of the characters that are actually extremely similar from book to movies, or at least his character journey, his character arc are extremely similar. You know, the character arc of going from a timid, simple gardener to an absolute savage. However, one part I want to point out is that in the book we don't get the part where Gollum frames Sam for eating the lembas bread and Frodo kicks him out of the crew. Frodo banishes him. I think that adding this scene into the movie was so clever, so smart. I've already spoken about how I think the movies did Frodo dirty. I've made a big video about that. I'll leave a card up here. You can check that out if you want. But building this conflict and this distrust between these two characters, these two inseparable characters at a critical point of the story, drastically raised the stakes. I think that Sam leaving Frodo, or being told to leave Frodo, did two very important things. Those two things, I think, are that whole sequence greatly complemented both Sam and Frodo's characters. Sam leaving gave him the opportunity to return. It gave Sam a choice at arguably the most difficult part of his journey. By being told to leave, he was given the choice to go back towards potential safety, or he could go after Frodo into Mordor, and what he truly believed was his death, was his doom. He didn't think he was coming back from that. Sam chose death because he loved Frodo and he wanted to destroy the ring. Having that choice, that's the word, that choice, added in the movies was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. The second thing, it also really helped Frodo's character story because he also had a choice. He had to choose between Sam and Smeagol. We may hate Frodo for the choice that he made, but it is important. Frodo chose to believe Smeagol, first of all because he was under the influence of the ring, and that showed just how deeply Frodo was under the ring's power at this part of the story, again at this critical part of the story. Sam was his best friend in the world. It's probably the person that he cared about more than anyone else, and he turned Sam away. That was the influence of the ring. That was the power of the ring over him, and that just helped, and it foreshadowed the climax of the story where Frodo refuses to destroy the ring. And also, Frodo chose Smeagol because he needed to believe, the Hobbit in him needed to believe that there was good left in there, that he could come back from that. Frodo thought, if Smeagol is lying, if Smeagol is truly only Gollum, then that must be his fate as well. Such a small sequence of events, such a small part of the story tells us so much, and it's just beautiful. So there are a bunch of other changes that make me love the movies more than the books, but they don't really warrant much explanation, so I'm just gonna fire some off at you like one after the other. But first, just to throw a bone to the people who like the books more than the movies and might be disagreeing with me really hard right now, I will say this. I hate what the movies did to Frodo and Faramir. Again, I made a full video defending Frodo against the people who say, "No cap, Frodo wasn't even a hero, bro. That shit was all Sam." But I blame the movies. They turned Frodo into a doughy-eyed dope who just constantly lets things happen to him rather than doing things to push the story forward. He is constantly the damsel in distress, and it sucks. In the book, he is much more active, much more of a badass. Then we have Faramir, who was turned into a glorified Xbox achievement for Pippin. Achievement unlocked, stop dad from burning his own son. Faramir was much cooler in the book and also a lot more likable. In the movies, he's kind of like this pathetic jerk, but there you go. There are some things that I hate about the movies that I think were far superior in the book. But let's go back to the unbridled praise. Gimli and Legolas's banter and bromance in the movies. Merry and Pippin having more of a Fred and George dynamic rather than Merry just being a bit more grouchy in the books. Way more battles and conflict in the movies makes it a lot more exciting. Merry and Pippin have a lot more active role in the Ents' attack on Isengard rather than just being there to see it happen. Changing Sam from Frodo's servant or his gardener to his homie. Making Sauron a formless, mystically dangerous presence rather than just a big dude. 3 words: wizard, breakdance, battle. I love the Lord of the Rings books and everything they have done for fantasy and storytelling at large. Everything they've done for fantasy in particular. I think a lot of fantasy now, I think modern fantasy today has primarily Tolkien to thank. And obviously without the books, we wouldn't have the movies. But I have to admit that I am more impressed by what a dedicated film crew and a tidy budget were able to create. I don't think Fran Walsh gets nearly enough credit for what her screenwriting brought to the table with Lord of the Rings. For example, the iconic "You shall not pass!" That was her. Creating a set of movies like Lord of the Rings in 2001 should not have been possible. It should have been beyond human ability, or at the very least it should have been beyond what people would be willing to do when it comes to the amount of effort that film crew and that cast would need to perform. But they did it. The movies have aged just as well as Elijah Wood, while the books can be needlessly dense despite their brilliance and is a lot harder for modern fantasy readers to get into. What do you think anyway? Books or movies? Are there any differences between the two that you have any strong opinions on? I hope you liked this video. I know it was a bit long, but I really wanted to go in depth with this and really show you just how passionately I adore this story. It means a lot to me that you've watched the whole video. It really does. I'd love it if you give it a like. And hey, if you're not already subscribed and you like videos about, deep dives into discussions about books, fantasy, and horror, I would love it if you stuck around. I think that should just about do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. Catch ya.